Hello, bonjour. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University here on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, Canada. I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between research, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and other parts of the world, but especially focused on the needs and opportunities identified by our working groups in East Africa and in the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity building, policy engagement, and public dialogue, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime, especially working to find solutions and protection both with and for refugees. As I've mentioned twice already in my opening comments, I do want to recognize and acknowledge that the land on which I reside and the land on which Carleton University is to be found is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I say that not just out of protocol and not just out of respect, but out of an effort to recognize my own positionality as a settler Canadian, but also to recognize the fact that these questions about trust, about partnership, about dispossession and dislocation, about learning, about shifting of power, that these are questions that are very much part of the history and the contemporary politics of the place where I reside, in addition to the context that we'll be discussing in the webinar today. But let me say how delighted I am to welcome so many attendees to this second webinar in the series with LERRN and the Refugee Research Network, the RRN. This series tries to look at questions of ethics, power, partnership in the research process and how the building of more equitable, informed, and might I say enlightened partnerships can enhance the kind of research that we can do, but also the role that knowledge can play in leveraging a certain kind of change that we would like to see. We have a wonderful group of speakers with us today. I'll introduce Susan McGrath in a moment, who can convey the regrets of Maha Shuayb, who's unable to join us at the very last minute due to personal circumstances that were unanticipated. But I am very much looking forward to being part of the conversation today, not to take Maha's place. As I said in our introduction as speakers, I would never claim as a white male tenured professor with my hegemonic position here in Canada and the global north. I would never claim to speak on Maha's behalf, far from it. Instead, I very much hope to be able to share what I have learned from conversations with Maha and other partners within the LERRN network in really speaking to some of the questions and the themes that we're addressing in the webinar today. But I am really delighted and really honored to be sharing this space and co-moderating today with Susan McGrath, someone I have known and learnt from for more years than I will admit. Maybe Susan will, but Susan is a professor emerita at York University, former director of the Center for Refugee Studies, and director and real visionary and leader within the Refugee Research Network. And I'd like to say very publicly that, you know, what LERRN it does in terms of its efforts is very much in response to the lessons that have been learned from the amazing leadership from Susan in guiding the Refugee Research Network from 2008 onwards. If you're interested, you really should read the Mobilizing Global Knowledge, which is the book that really sheds so much light on these questions and documents the experience of many aspects of the Refugee Research Network. The book is available. That's the one thing I didn't do before the webinar, is put my telephone away. It's a book that really does document the experience of the Refugee Research Network and provide a foundation for so many of the questions that we're going to be speaking to today. It is available open access, and I encourage you to look at that. So with that, let me say how delighted we are to have some 50 participants with us for this webinar. Wherever you're joining us from, I hope that you're safe and well. And with that, it's a real privilege to turn over proceedings to Susan McGrath. Susan, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, James, and thank you for the generous introduction. Very pleased to be part of the Refugee Research Network, which you've kindly acknowledged perhaps was a precursor to what LERRN has been. And I think one of the exciting things for me is that LERRN has taken up some of the challenges that we discovered in the Refugee Research Network. The network was an effort to try and bring together researchers globally, and we had 13 research centers as partners, and fortunately in each region, North and South America, Middle East, Europe, and Asia. We continue to focus now on knowledge mobilization. James mentioned the book, and very pleased. Our partners really wrote about some of their experiences and the challenges of doing research, of building networks. We've got particularly Beatriz Sanchez wrote about the difficulties in Latin America, for instance. So there are some very real life experiences here about some of the challenges of practicing research, building networks, and working locally and regionally. The cover of the book is a tree, and a tree with many, many branches. Yes, there, thank you. And Nergis Chenefe, one of the authors, painted this for us because one of the commentaries from our authors, our participants, was that the network had too many roots, not enough branches. We needed more branches. We needed more regional and local participation. And part of the challenge, of course, is how do we do that? How do we support regional projects? Our partners who were working in Latin America, and we tried to set up a network with them there and work for a while, but it was largely the lack of resources and funding wasn't sustainable. Although I'm pleased to hear that that was in Colombia, led by colleagues in Colombia. Colleagues in Chile looked to they're trying to do some networking there now too. So I think the interest and the commitment to try and link researchers working on forced migration issues is there and is present, but it's challenging. And so we're very fortunate to have people today who have been through that experience of organizing, mobilizing, and are able to tell us about it. As James mentioned, unfortunately, Maha Shuayb is not able to be with us. She had a family emergency and was called away. So James has worked in there. LERRN has the project. Maha is leading the LERRN project in the Middle East. She works at the Center for Lebanese Studies in Beirut. And so he is going to try and fill in as he can, as best, in terms of some of the thoughts and experiences that in terms of developing in the Middle East and what that has been about. So we really regret that Maha isn't able to be here, and she sends her regrets. But we do have Alice Na and Mark Okello Oyat with us, and pleased to introduce Alice. I'm good fortune knowing Alice for many years. She's a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics at the University of York, and that's University of York in the UK, not in Canada, and conducts research on asylum and migration in Asia. She's well recognized internationally as an expert on forced migration in Asia. She's a founding member of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, and this is an open network of over 200 active civil society organizations and individuals from 38 countries. They're committed to advancing the rights of refugees in the Asia Pacific region. She also chairs the board of the International Detention Coalition, and that's a global network of over 400 organizations, groups, and individuals based in over 100 countries who are working to secure the human rights of people who are affected by immigration detention. And the board of Protection International. This is an international nonprofit organization that supports human rights defenders in over 30 countries. So Alice is well familiar with the creation and the management of networks, and we look forward to hearing about her expertise and thoughts. Mark Okello Oyat is a Ugandan refugee residing in Dadaab, Kenya. Unfortunately, Mark's camera is not working today, so we're unable to see him, but you will see an image of him live, but you'll see an image of him when he is presenting. He is a founding member and director of the Dadaab Response Association, and that's a community-based organization of local and refugee researchers that looks to lead research initiatives in the Dadaab region. Mark and his team are refugee scholars in encampment. Some of their work on refugee education has been published in LERRN's working paper series and includes Mark's paper, Investigating Corporal Punishment in Refugee Secondary Schools in Dadaab, Kenya. And members of the Dadaab Response Association have presented their work at international conferences. I've seen them a couple of times at the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. Mark is a graduate of York University here in Toronto, Canada, with his Master of Education, and he got that through the Borderless Higher Education for Refugees project, known as the BEAR project, and that's led by Winona Giles and Don Dippo. He did his BA at York also. He got the highest honor, summa cum laude. So Mark is well familiar with the challenges conducting research in sites of displacement and working with researchers and partners in the global north. So welcome to you both. What we were going to do, the format is pose some questions and then our participants will answer them. And again, James will try and fill in his comment about things around the Middle East, that the region that Maha would have addressed. So to start off, I'd like to sort of ask you just to talk about your experiences, in this topic, why you think that this conversation around refugee research partnerships and setting the agenda, how that's important to you. And can we start with you, Alice?
Thank you very much, Susan and James, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation and this series of conversations, which I think is so important. I mean, I guess why this topic is important is you know, it's clear for me that the kind of research that I want to be part of is research that addresses the issues that refugees and host communities face, you know, and I want it to be relevant to their lives and to make an impact. And I think that comes from my personal background. I started off, you know, working with refugees as an activist, as an advocate, and sort of, you know, being frustrated at all the struggles and, you know, that I saw that refugees experience and the hostile environment that existed for them in Southeast Asia. And that was deeply troubling for me. I was troubled, I mean, not just at how refugees were being treated or how their rights were not respected, but also what it said about us as a society, you know, us Malaysians, us Southeast Asianists. We who live in this region, what does it say about us as a society when we treat refugees in this particular way? So I think I always approach this topic from sort of looking at the issues that needed to be dealt with, and so the applied nature of my work has always started from there. But I think this conversation is also important because now that I'm a scholar or an academic, you realize that there are many forces that we have to deal with, the ways in which academia is constructed, that actually takes us away from research that is relevant, that is reciprocal, that is ethically grounded in the way that it's presented in this fora. And that's partly, you know, I think your explanation of this meeting, you know, highlighted donor expectations and priorities, but it's also the way I think academia has been set up and how, you know, research agendas are determined not just by, you know, what are issues on the ground that need attention, but also what are theoretically interesting and engaging topics to pay attention to. So sometimes it's the scholarly disciplines and the ways that we are rewarded or not rewarded as academics that influence the way we approach research or the time we have for it. So I think it's also an acknowledgement that there are constraints placed upon us as academics that we need to grapple with. And so that in a way holds us back or makes it difficult for us to do research that is really reciprocal, that is impactful, that makes a difference in the lives of refugees. So I just wanted to say that it's you know, that makes this conversation even more important because of the challenges of doing this kind of research.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mark, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I thank everybody, and I'm very delighted to be among the LERRN community today. This conversation is very important to me because it is who I am. It is about refugees, and then the story or the issue that makes it very important is because within an encampment, in most cases, we get people coming outsiders, do come and with particular research questions of their interests. When they come with that one, they go around and research on, but then they do not imagine that there are certain questions within encampment that would have been addressed apart from their issues that they have come all along the way overseas to the camp. Therefore, the kind of voices that we create within as researchers from encampment is out of the situations that we have realized that do exist. From here, we are now seeing the impact of humanitarian regime on the refugee situation. And then we try to talk about it and see what happens with it. However, out of my studies, which was very important for me to have come up to this long, was able to inform me on several issues, and training me on research issues has brought me to see the uniqueness of the voices of refugees in their own studies, so that we can make our voices heard and not any other person talking about us. So if we talk about ourselves, it is like bringing to the open the exactness of something that somebody is seeing from within, and not like an outsider who comes and then relatively tells our stories according to her experience or his experience from that position of power or position of privilege, and so on and so on. So we are telling our stories from our position as the vulnerable people. And it is also important to realize that in that context, we become the voice of the voiceless. So it is very important to realize that empowering refugees to do their own research will give empowerment to themselves, because if they are heard beyond the encampment, scholars like from different parts of the world can connect with them and associate with them. So in that association, that is what has helped us and has elevated us to be what we are today. When we got connected with LERRN, we were able to start from a low profile, but at the moment we see that we are climbing and being seen. So the image and the way in which we are being shown projects a positive reflection of what LERRN is really doing to all the refugee network that are doing research, which is very important. Without that, you are aware that refugee researchers have no capability in terms of research ethics, in terms of funding, and so many other things, unless you are attached or affiliated to another organization which is well recognized. Otherwise, you cannot do any research. So we become very much delighted and very free. We know that whatever we are doing is for a purpose. And therefore, feel free to ask me any question, and I will be very much willing to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And we'll be posing some questions as we go along, but there'll also be an opportunity at the end for the audience to ask questions. So, and you could actually start doing that in the Q&A as we go, if you like. So I don't know, James, if you had any thoughts about the Middle East context in terms of why this is important in terms of setting the research agenda.
Yeah, no, I very much so, and again, I don't claim to speak on behalf of Maha and her experience. I've learned quite a bit from her writing on this, and I can share some of that in the links. But I also note that Dr. Urub El-Abed is in the audience, who's LERRN's lead researcher in the context of Jordan, and so perhaps in the discussion time, Urub, if you're willing and able, happy to bring you into this conversation. And I think the question of why this topic is important is very much at the heart of why LERRN decided to undertake this 7-year initiative, and why it's important is very much in response to arguments that that Chimney made 20 years ago, that Lauren Landau has made in his work. And Rachel, if I could ask you to put up the link to the article in the Journal of Refugee Studies that I recently published with Richa Shivakoti, is this notion of localization of knowledge. The reason why this is so important is that we've had such a significant increase in research on refugee issues, but without understanding questions of power, questions of trust, questions of positionality, questions of roles within the research process, that the risk is that we, in Chimney's words from more than 20 years ago, that we risk reproducing certain policy paradigms, certain tropes, and certain assumptions within our work. So the reason why this is important is not only the ethical question in terms of ensuring that, you know, the whole purpose of the academic enterprise is that it's inclusive and open to different perspectives and lines of inquiry, but beyond the ethical imperative for a more inclusive approach to research, is very much the question of what role research might play in contributing to change, in contributing to protection, in contributing to solutions. And I think what we have found, and I think Mark said it so very well, is that we have seen other actors included in the research enterprise, but included in ways that are very subordinate, and they're very much in the rise of literature, you know, of refugee research assistants, and you know, what Catherine Brun has called the refugee research industry. I commend to you, and I'll put the link up in the box, a piece in the Journal of Refugee Studies that Catherine Brun and Maha recently published about carving out space for equitable partnerships. It's to recognize that without confronting and shining a light on these challenges of inequality, that we enter into a research enterprise that may engage a range of different perspectives. But if those perspectives are engaged in a way that's unequal, in a way that's, you know, asymmetrical, then what it does is it reproduces the very tropes and the very paradigms that we're seeking to overcome. And so this has been at the heart of LERRN's journey, learning from the Refugee Research Network and the effort, Susan, that you led. Really the reason why this topic is important to me, is important to all the partners in LERRN, is really the question of, if we do things differently, and if we do things in a way that's more equitable, is there a different kind of knowledge that can be produced? And can that knowledge contribute to the kind of change that intuitively we want to see? And so I'm happy to be able to contribute to this conversation. But looking at the many colleagues in the audience, I know that there are wonderful questions that will come from others, and it's a pleasure to be part of the conversation. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. So I maybe turn to our first question, and general or specific question. So you've talked a bit about, Alice and Mark, you both talked about the importance of having local voices and getting those people involved. So can you talk about how to set these research agendas locally? What's it like to actually to be able to do this, and to make sure that the research that's done is relevant? And then we can talk a bit about the experiences that you've had in doing that. Can we start with Alice?
She is muted.
I think maybe go to Mark first. I think if Alice is encountering the same dreaded Zoom update that jumped onto my screen this morning, maybe Susan, if we could go to Mark first, and hopefully by then Alice's Zoom will have completed its update.
Okay.
Okay, Mark, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. the research that we normally do here is very up to date in that we normally, for instance, with LERRN, whenever we are doing a research, the research agenda itself, we look for the research topic, which we can source from within what is important. And then out of that, we, through Carleton University, because I personally have done what they call the research ethics of North America. And therefore, it is not very difficult for me to be integrated within any university in Canada or the United States of America when it comes to research. I can only produce my certificate, and then it will be accepted. And therefore, that particular university that I'm affiliated with, I provide what I'm going to do ethically. Then it is reviewed by that research board of that university. And I collect the data. The data that I collect will determine the kind of research that I'm going to produce. And therefore, whatever I do here is for the community, because the situation or the challenge that I have seen in the community is what I do research upon. And I also do what is called action research. Therefore, with an action research, because we want changes to be there within our community, we are not just doing it for knowledge production, but we do research so that the research that we do can produce, can change the community, can bring change in our society. There's no way in which we just do it for knowledge production. It has to carry a purpose. And with the network that we have now so far had, we have been able to be the voice of our people. In case of any challenge, we move through our network and ensure that things are corrected. And that is what we are enjoying here in the camp, and continue to work for our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think we lost Alice. She may be trying to do her computer in terms of getting a computer back on. James, you've talked a little bit about the challenges in terms of what the goals of what LERRN trying to do. Maybe you can talk a bit about what your sense of what's going on in the Middle East and the efforts that are being done to make sure that the research that is being developed is responsive to those who are working locally.
Yeah, no, thank you, Susan. And I think, you know, this speaks to, and again, not specific to the Middle East, but also what we've seen in the context of East Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania as well. And Mark has spoken to some of this, is really the question of how we can ensure that local research agendas are, you know, locally relevant or locally driven. And it goes back to some of the earlier questions, and interestingly, Rula El Rifai from IDRC has put the question in the Q&A box about the idea of guiding principles for equitable partnerships, or guiding principles on on how to go about doing research in a way that is mindful of these questions of power and relationships. And this is something that Maha has been leading a discussion on, exactly this question. And as Rula says in her Q&A box, that a lot of these practices, you know, LERRN is far from the only group that has tried to address these kinds of issues. In our first webinar in this series, we heard from Elena Fidia Kismia and the work that she has been doing also in the context of the Middle East, and many, many others. What we see are these recurring questions around power, around trust, around roles, and around resources. You know, Mark mentioned the question of, you know, at what moment partners enter into the research relationship. And I think one of the things that we've seen loud and clear, and as mentioned in the article that I co-authored with Richa Shivakati, is this question: if the research agendas and the research questions are designed in the global north and then brought into the global south, they're going to represent the interests and the priorities of those actors within the global north. There was an article that was published not that long ago in the Journal of African Cultural Studies. It said, and the title by Elizabeth Tilley and Mark Kalina, and the title of the article is "My Flight Arrives at 5 a.m. Can you pick me up? The Gatekeeping Burden of the African Academic." I'll put the link to that article in the chat box in just a moment. But I mean, I see Alice, I see you smiling, because we've all sort of heard that story about I've come up with this research question, and it's not just a north-south question. I mean, we hear this here in Ottawa with a group called Refugee 613 that does service delivery with resettled refugees in the Ottawa area. And they say, we're sick and tired of getting phone calls saying, I'm doing this research and I need access to 12 Syrian refugee women next Thursday afternoon, preferably at 2 o'clock. Can you set it up for me, please? Without any discussion about what the research question is or where it comes from or what that relationship is. So I recognize the work of Christina Clark-Kazak in really driving the development of the ethical standards, the ethical guidelines for this research, and the section on partnership is a very important start. Those have been adopted by the Canadian Council for Refugees, CARFMS, but also the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. But what it really comes down to is trust and is trying to find those everyday moments where those power relationships can be shifted. And so it really does start, I hate to be a capitalist on this, but it really does start with a question of resources. So who controls resources and who is able to set the agenda of how those resources are used? So LERRN started its work with an understanding that it's a Canadian grant, it's Canadian taxpayers' dollars. Those funds come to Carleton University, but the idea is that the agenda is set by our working groups in East Africa and in the Middle East and our partners like the Dadaab Response Association. So the allocation of the funding that they receive, it's for them to tell us how the resources can be most responsive to the needs and opportunities within their region. So there's the question of that responsiveness around resources. But second, there's the question about when that relationship begins in terms of, setting the research question, designing the methodology. If partners in major refugee hosting regions, if they come in, once the research has been designed and the research questions have been set, that relationship will always be asymmetrical. So it's this idea of being full partners right the way through the process, but also in ceding power. Something that I would note about the work not only of Mark, the working paper on corporal punishment, but all of the work that's been published by members of the Dadaab Response Association coming out of their master's projects with the Borderless Higher Education for Refugees. You look at the questions that have been posed by the Dadaab Response Association, and you compare that to the research agenda of international education and emergency scholarship, and Kathleen Brun and Maha Shuayb again have written on this. And what you find is that when the agenda is the agenda setting stage, when that is driven by local perspectives, the questions that are asked are very different. And so it's if that relationship doesn't happen at that moment, the rest of the edifice is on really shaky grounds. LERRN is very fortunate that we had the opportunity to build these relationships, to build this trust in person before the pandemic. And so since the pandemic, when the work has really moved online into a reality like this, is that we found that we're able to draw on that trust, on those relationships that were established in person, and to carry us through. But the last point that I'd say, Susan, is something that we very much heard in the research that was supported by IDRC in interviewing heads of research centers across the Global South, is there are times where the partnership model of partnered north-south research is really important and very vibrant, if for nothing else, in terms of accessing the resources necessary to do that research. And so there's one set of questions around how we function within a partnership. And of course, that's the focus of this webinar. But there's also the question of how support can be mobilized for researchers that are closest to the phenomenon of displacement, especially in the global south, where 85% of the world's refugees are to be found, in terms of not having to rely on partnerships to conduct research. And here I'd want to mention the IDRC program of funding research chairs in the Middle East, in East Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in Latin America, as an example of how we can move away from an exclusive reliance on partnership to what we might call the localization of research, which includes not only the shifting of resources, but the shifting of power, the shifting of leadership, to ensure that that research agenda can be driven by those that are closest to the phenomenon of forced displacement. So that's been very central to LERRN. It's something that we've learned from Maha, but others such as Urub, such as Koti Kamanga in Tanzania, Dulo Nyaro in Kenya, and our partners who've been doing this work for so many years. So I'm happy to share that perspective and very happy to see Alice back online.
Thank you. Glad to have you back, Alice. Just before we come to you, though, I'll make a comment. Urub has put a comment, and I think a very important one. And she's talking about the research that the Center for Lebanese Studies has conducted in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and in countries that have provided little protection to refugees, and how important that the research is. I just somehow lost, where did it go? Got to get back to her. But anyway, I think it's really important, a good point, that research provides local researchers with the capacity to speak to local policies and perspectives that are domineering and are not supportive. And also you mentioned the importance of having different strategies using art and artistic methods in terms of engaging refugee participants. And so in order their voices can be heard in many different ways and not just in text. So Alice, thank you for being back. And
yes.
You can comment to us and really talking about, how do we really engage and get the local voices out, and some of the challenges that need to be overcome and addressed in doing so.
Thank you. I mean, when I was contemplating this research question, I really struggled with it. This question that you've posed, which is a really good one, because, the question, how can research agendas be locally driven and locally relevant? And I think really the starting point is that refugees on the ground, wherever they are, and practitioners as well, are constantly struggling with issues and problems that they want to understand better and to study. So the problems, the issues, the questions are ever present everywhere. Yeah. The question really is, how do those issues and problems get onto research agendas? And this brings us to the question of whose research agenda. Why is it that some research agendas are given priority, some are more well-resourced, and that's not just in terms of finances, but in terms of the technical skills as well. And it brings us to the question of who is the audience for this research agenda, yeah, and who is the research for? So in a way, we sort of have to flip it on its head, because actually the issues and the problems are ever present everywhere. It's just that they are made invisible, or they're not deemed as important, or they're not seen as, sort of worthy of investment in a way. And so, James is absolutely right when he says it's about who has the power to turn something into something worthy of investigation, worthy of investment. And there has to be an audience for it, So yeah, I really want us to think about, in a way, the politics of knowledge production have to do with who has resources, who is deemed to be the right audience, and who is the research for. And I must say, it is a struggle to really have locally driven research agendas, because often even scholars, globally, not just in the global north, but in the global south, our research agendas are dictated by things or forces other than what is locally relevant. It is dictated by what our discipline views as useful. It's dictated by what sort of theoretical contribution we want to make. And so there are many sort of ways of shifting our attentions away from, what is locally relevant to other things that matter. And in some ways, those things matter more than what is locally salient. So that's something we need to think about. Why is it that our eyes are turned away from what is a priority in different locales?
An important point in terms of the demands on different researchers. And look, I guess no matter where you are a researcher, I think we work in the North have the advantage of having lots of capacity. We just walk down the hall and there are printers and lots of IT people if you get into difficulty. And yet in trying to have a conversation with colleagues in the Global South, sometimes the power goes out, it starts to rain and that's it. And they don't have a lot of RAs who are available to help with their research. But I think this question about how do we set up these research partnerships and how do we seek out partners and that can be supportive, that are going to have these egalitarian relationships that are going to enable us to actually do the research that we want to do. I don't know, we maybe speak to a little bit about that. James, I don't know if you wanted to also, you've had some points also. Thank you that Urub has made some contributions to online.
I would note, I've just sent you a chat to this effect. Urub has very kindly offered to leave the virtual audience and join us up on the platform, which I think would be a very useful thing to bring her perspective into this conversation. And I would like to say to everyone in the audience, this is totally unscripted. So this is Susan, if as we've agreed, I think that this is the best way to make sure that perspective from the Middle East is directly reflected, as opposed to through me as a very imperfect intermediary. So I've just taken the liberty of clicking the button, and in a moment, Urub, just imagine as if we were in a virtual, in a virtual space. If we were in a real space, Urub would be making her way up from the back of the lecture hall, slowly walking down the aisle up onto the stage, and any second now, magically, she's going to appear on the screen. And when she does, Susan, I'd be happy to introduce Urub. And I know that Urub, with the comments, would be able to jump right into the conversation. So I'm grateful for that. And look at that, as if on cue, Urub has joined us. Urub, I would like to say that that is welcome. Just the most wonderful and heroic act, completely unscripted, to join us. Welcome, Urub. It's a real privilege to be able to introduce to members of the panel and to the audience, my real privilege to introduce Dr. Urub El-Abed. We do have a bio for Urub on the website, and we'll post that in a moment. But Urub is someone that for whom I have just such tremendous respect and admiration. Urub is the principal investigator for the Center for Lebanese Studies, but based in Amman, Jordan. Urub's own work since her doctoral work at SOAS has focused on questions of rights and access and citizenship, not only with Palestinian refugees, first in Egypt, and now the amazing work that she's been doing in Jordan, but such a critical voice on this question of youth engagement, on the trajectories from education to empowerment, and what she has been doing recently in trying to look beyond the dominant narratives and paradigms in a space like Jordan, in looking at nationalities that are underrepresented in the research, Sudanese, Somali, Yemeni refugees in Amman. And Urub is also the regional coordinator of research that we are doing on refugee-led organizations, refugee-led initiatives in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Turkey. And in this regard, Urub leads a team of researchers that are themselves displaced or from within the region, and so setting a research agenda and a research approach that is very much in line with the questions that we've mentioned in this webinar in terms of it being locally driven and not externally imposed. So Susan, Alice, Mark, I know that I believe you've certainly seen each other on the screen before, but Alice and Susan, it's a pleasure to introduce you to Urub. Susan, this is moderating on the fly, but let me pass things back to you if you'd like to pose an initial question to Urub, and then we can return to the questions that we've agreed ahead of time.
Thank you, James, but also thank you, Urub, for joining us at this, and it's great. And you've made some great comments on the chat, but perhaps you want to speak to them a little bit. I think you're really bringing some important points and specific to your context too.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, James. Thank you everyone for having me in such a very unexpected way, as James said, from the very much of the back of the theater. In fact, I'm really sorry. I was writing and I was doing several things. So I felt that this is very much of an occasion to talk about the research. Thanks, James, for mentioning our research, where in our research, very much talking to a point that has been raised in the last few years by the UNHCR about refugee-led organizations, where the UN, here we're talking about a policy body, trying to put an emphasis on the kind of institutionalization of the refugee momentum on the ground. With LERRN, we have managed to get funding to try to understand what is the voice, what has been really been done by the refugees on the ground. And this very much talks to the debate that we're having here, is that how we can bring in refugee researchers to be involved with us, we researchers, very much looking into academic literature and academic reviews to understand what we are doing and why we are studying them. This is one element. And secondly, why donors are very much interested in coming and funding the kind of research that we are doing. And what is really, and here we come to the main point, is what is really the role of the researchers, refugee researchers, in being involved with us and engaging with us. Is it really just to do the work? Are we bringing them in really to do the work that we cannot do it because we cannot come into the little circles? Or is it, here we come to that point, is that are we really empowering them? As very much Mark Okello mentioned, are we really creating this position of power for these people to make any kind of pressure on states, on policymakers, on who? This is one of the things that I must say in the current research that we're doing. In previous research I have done, particularly on Palestinians from Gaza that have been living in Jordan for more than 65 years, where they have no rights or voice. We've been stopping and wondering, is research a way for us to put any kind of pressure? And to whom? And I'm just very much talking to a point that James raised, is that what is the role of research that can play vis-a-vis these people? I'd like really here to highlight a few points. One, when we are living, and we were yesterday in a discussion about authoritarian states, when we are talking to authoritarian states, is the role of partnership, this is the point that I was very much mentioning in the Q&A box, Susan, is the point of doing this kind of partnership, are we standing against the authoritarianism that has been very much nurtured, whether we like it or not, by the international community? Is it a way for us to stand against this kind of oppression that they are doing against the refugees by creating little spaces for them through our research and through engaging with them to be part of our work? This is one of the points that we are very much questioning. Is that through our research we are really creating this space? One. And my second question is, when we are doing this kind of collaboration, are we really making use of my partnership with James and LERRN? Are we trying to make better advocacy? Three of the researchers that we have been doing at CLS, we are very much asked to do certain advocacy and the advocacy that is not only limited to governments, and here we come to some answers, that we don't necessarily need to limit ourselves only to research that is done through words, but also research that is done through theater. This is one of the things that we've done recently in our research with the trajectories, studying trajectories of young people. So we managed to create the space for the refugees with the support of the international donors, and we have IDRC with us, thanks to Rula Rifai, where we managed to create the space through theater, through exhibitions, through certain documentaries. In fact, we are now trying to do documentaries where we are enabling the voice of refugees in partnership with the Global North through these kind of spaces that are a little bit going beyond the very much language that is sometimes disturbs the government, especially when we're talking about authoritarian governments. Maha is not with us, and we're having the context of a country like Lebanon, where sometimes the state is failing to do its role vis-a-vis its own citizens. So how can we question the state when we are talking about its own refugees? So this is another element that we have been also thinking of when we are addressing the issue of refugees. I'm just bringing in certain points, answering some of the points that were raised, but I'm happy to address some of your questions. I had another point, but I'm going to leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Urub. I think you're asking some of those profound questions, you know, is it what we're doing, is it working, and what impact is it having, and are we certainly reaching policy actors? And I think this idea of disturbing the state and what the consequences of disturbing the state can sometimes be. Perhaps we could come back to Alice and then to Mark, and I think to talk about these questions about engaging with the research and also then presenting this research. I guess one of the questions, like, can you partner with the state, for instance? Is that possible to partner with states? And certainly you've had a lot of experience, Alice, with the Refugee Network in Southeast Asia on trying to negotiate with states.
Yeah, no, Susan, thank you. And as you know, Urub was sharing, and I'm looking at the comments as well. I think we need to recognize that there's a difference between, you know, scholars determining the research agenda and then bringing in refugees into the research process, or bringing in local researchers into the research process. That's one particular way of working. But another way of working is actually to start from the beginning by refugees, you know, being involved in even conceptualizing what the problems are, you know, and local researchers as well. So, and recognizing that, you know, the research agenda can truly be driven by them if, first of all, we prioritize what they see to be important to be studied, you know. So, you know, the example that you shared from Mark, you know, where the paper that he wrote, it's a problem that he saw as being important and salient in his community, and then developing a research project around that. So I think even from, you know, setting what topics need to be studied and how you study them, you know, letting it come from the ground as opposed to, you know, from the outside, from far away. The question is, how can we resource these projects and then position them so that they speak not just to a local audience, but to an international audience as well. This is an issue in this camp, but it's not just this camp where it's an issue, it's a broader issue, you know, facing communities around the world, something that scholars also need to grapple with. So I think it's also repositioning issues that are determined from the ground as being relevant, but also situating it then within the framework of our knowledge, you know? Yeah. I mean, I want to distinguish also, I mean, I broadly categorize them as refugees and practitioners and scholars, but also recognizing that even local researchers, right, also navigate sort of complex power relationships between these different communities. And these three different communities have their own concerns, right? So, you know, scholars tend to be, and I am, you know, simplifying, and I really do apologize for that. But scholars are sort of driven by theoretical, you know, contributions. You know, what can the research contribute to theoretical frameworks? Practitioners need solutions to practical problems or to policy relevant issues. and refugees, are grappling with the realities of where they live. And so I think if we are to develop meaningful research partnerships, we need to recognize that each of us are located in a different position in society, but not only that, what we see as priorities are different, So in order to bring these different partners together, we need to recognize, our different positionality, but the things that concern us, and try to find that there are places where we do overlap and places where we don't overlap. And that's fine. And if we can design a project that enables us to focus on common concerns and areas where we can collaborate easily, but also build in extra resources so that, let's say, practitioners can take the research findings into fora that scholars may not have access to, that refugees can, are resourced to bring the research findings to their own communities. And maybe it's not appropriate or suitable for practitioners or scholars to be in those spaces, but there are ways of turning the research findings into things and into, communication events that matter to the different sectors, then that's a broader way of looking at research, not just driven and framed by scholars, but jointly framed so that the needs and the different expectations of different sectors are also met, through the resources that are available.
Thank you, Alice. And I think there's some of us, I'm thinking Mark is also a refugee and a researcher at the same time, so can occupy the same different positions and from different challenges. So Mark, I don't know if you can speak also to the experience of that. And then also the point around authoritarian regimes, because you are very much functioning. And we talked a bit earlier about a regime that has not been supportive of refugees, is now claiming to be, but perhaps you could speak to that too.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. I would say that a refugee researcher has a lot of roles that they play on the ground. At one time, of course, let me first of all say that research itself is a process of advocacy. So any research that is done can lead to advocacy because it is a fact that somebody collects on the ground and uses it for advocacy. So in that process of advocacy, without any fact that you can present as an evidence that you have got on the ground, nobody will accept just the verbal discussion or talk. So this evidence that we get on the ground as advocates has given us a lot of power to make changes on the ground. And without that, we cannot move anywhere. We cannot change situations. We cannot present maybe the policymakers of your choice with an evidence that she or he can move it forward to other policymakers to lobby them for change. So with the kind of voices that we present, and the research that we do locally here will create a very big impact in lobbying for advocacy so that changes can occur. And that is what we are doing here in Kenya. We make sure that we do research and lobby for changes. At the moment, in that situation, like currently, we have seen a lot of issues happening, closure of the camps and so on. So through that, we were able to lobby the civil society organizations within the context of Kenya to stand firm to ensure that such a thing should not happen within the Kenyan border. And it was very successful. And at the moment, as I'm talking, 2 days ago, the president also signed the refugee bill into a law, which has stayed for so many years. So this one will only be achieved when you give refugees a voice to identify their challenges and move forward internationally and elsewhere to advocate for their rights. Without that, it is not possible. Refugees have to be allowed to do such research activities to make their lives better. they have to be at the forefront to fight for their own, for their emancipation. Without that, it becomes very difficult and very problematic. They will continuously be sequestered in a very chaotic situation, as we see all over the world. They need a space, and that space can only be achieved through networking, through funding, through different organizations around the world that can give them support, to give them space, and they will be able to do quite a lot of things. Other people can pick from where they have stopped to show the evidence. And that's where we stand firm to say that this relationship is very important to bring the agenda, the kind of thing that we would like to be discussed and promoted for the betterment of every human race in the world, without exclusion, whether somebody has been displaced or has run away from home and so on, because this situation is always there. So we are at the forefront to be supported and to promote it so that other refugees elsewhere can also copy what we are doing. Like me, I'm very much willing to go and educate those people elsewhere to ensure that they also become researchers like me. That is very important, so that we see the kind of issue that they go through and the solutions that they bring will be very interesting, because excluding them, refugees, is like creating a very big hole which will not be fulfilled or filled. For instance, during the COVID-19 era, that is 2020, if I may say. Of course, COVID-19 is still there, but we always associate COVID-19 with 2020. I wouldn't associate it with 2021 or 2019 when it erupted. But then at that period of time, we have seen a lot of refugees coming at the forefront to participate in ensuring that COVID-19 is controlled and contained within the space wherever they are. And that is the kind of humanity that we are advocating for, which should also be replicated to us as refugees. If we can also support humanity in fighting against all odds, why can't they support us to make our lives better through our own research questions that we have identified, and we want action to be taken upon so that our lives are better? That is the kind of situation that we would like to be encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's very helpful, and you've nicely addressed a question that was posed in our question Q&A load about what the local experience and how do we deal with data, and the importance of having data that you've said you've been able to take and actually use to have impact locally. These are not always the good stories that happen, because often presenting data can be put people at risk. So really appreciate that comment. Maybe we can now move to Q&A, and we'll come back to Alice and Urub and James in a minute to see also some other comments, and also please pitch in if you have comments you want to add. One of the questions about ethical research, and I think that's James mentioned earlier that Christina Clark-Kazak, who at the University of Ottawa has led an initiative to really develop guidelines, and they've been adopted by the International Association for Studies of Forced Migration. So if you go to their website, you'll find a code of ethics for conducting refugee research there. I guess the question, how do we still have Western perspectives? I think these are questions we have to continue to ask, I think, to make sure that, because for those of us who, I've grown up in the North, that's what my reality, but I've done a lot of work in the South, but always having to question, what do I bring and what do I not bring? And how do we really have a fair communication, and also making sure that my colleagues in other countries who are trying to be respectful and reverential to me, and are they doing that because I'm being too intimidating? So how do we make sure that when we're talking, we're really talking equally? And then one of the questions here is also about some guidelines around learning to do that. I don't know, this may be an opportunity, James, for you to mention that LERRN has actually produced an excellent series of training programs, and I think that hopefully will be available, but can help emerging scholars particularly, and because this series will be available online for those who may not be able to get to a program. But also the challenges that for us who are teaching research, that really to ensure that we are doing it and doing it with good questions, we're doing it critically, you know, with real reflexivity in terms of how we're teaching our students to learn research. James, do you want to mention the issue around the teaching emerging scholars?
Yeah, no, it's a critical point. So on the training question, something that we very quickly learned within LERRN and building from the experience of the RRN is in, and so the point that I made earlier is that there are many colleagues who are working on these questions in terms of power and relationships and inclusive, working in these kinds of contexts. And so something that LERRN is piloting in the winter term, so starting in January, is a 12-week online training program on equitable and ethical research approaches. A number of LERRN partners and members of a wider network, including Christina Clark-Kazak, and who we've mentioned, have contributed videos to this, and we'll be piloting it with an equal number of participants from the emerging scholars from the global north and scholars from the global south. And once we pilot it, we're then looking to roll this out and to make it more widely available online and in an accessible way. But I mention this not just to promote what LERRN is doing, but Susan, I think to speak to the really critical point. There's a growing, and we saw this at ISFM this past year, didn't we? That and Mark, you mentioned the lessons that we take away from the COVID pandemic. I mean, look at what we're doing right now, right? So here I am on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa. Susan is also in this space we call Ontario. There's Urub joining from Amman, Mark in Dadaab, Alice, you're in the UK. And so what we have found in the pandemic is the opportunity to have these inclusive conversations, the barriers, the excuses of why it's not possible, those barriers keep tumbling down. And I think what we really need to do coming out of the pandemic is to recognize two things. Number one, that we can mobilize technologies in a way to start these conversations in this very inclusive way, number one. But number two, the status quo ante is unacceptable, that we can't just default back to the way that we did things 5-6 years ago. You know, Alice, you talked about, you know, this notion of, you know, that there's an imperative in the way that we do research. I was fumbling around for the reference of David Turton's work, and now I've cleared it off my browser. But in 1996, David Turton wrote a chapter on migrants and refugees in the Tim Allen edited collection In Search of Cool Ground. And he made the point that research, and here I'll paraphrase and qualify the use of the term suffering, that research on human suffering is only ethically permissible if one of the objectives of that research is to alleviate the suffering that's studied. And something that Catherine Brunn and Maha have talked about quite a bit is the growth of the refugee research industry since 2015 and earlier. I point to the work that Rachel McNally, Nadia Rahim, and now Lily Nyang is contributing to that, looking at the research that's been published in the leading journals within the discipline and whose voice is present. I mention all of this, again, because there is a moment within the discipline to change the way we do things. And there's a moment in the discipline to be able to recognize not just the ethical value of approaching research in a way that's mindful of challenges, of developing these trust-based partnerships to set the research agenda. It's not just an ethically good thing, but it's a very powerful thing in terms of the research questions that we identify in terms of the legitimacy of that evidence that's produced to engage in those policy conversations that Urub mentioned in these highly contested environments. And so I think the challenge that we have now is to bring together this growing chorus of voices within the discipline. Again, LERRN is not the only group, RRN's not the only group, Alison and what she's done, we're not the only ones. And so how do we develop that strength in numbers? And I go back, I'm increasingly excited by Rula's point in the Q&A box of not sort of coming up with codes of conduct, but in really accumulating these best practices of how these very practical questions have been addressed, and how do we take those lessons to scale so that we're better as a discipline, and so that we're better as researchers, and we're better as partners. And in Mark's point, we're better as human beings as well. I'm incredibly energized by this conversation and by the opportunities that we identify. And whenever Alice nods her head in agreement with something that I say, I know I'm on the right track. So thank you for that reassurance, Alice.
Thank you, James. And I really want to come back perhaps to Alice and Mark and to Urub. I think also there's a physics phenomena. If you shine light on something, the cells change, it automatically change. And so I think there's this thing around research that when we shine light in shows and spaces that haven't seen light before, things change, and often in ways that we have no idea will happen. So I think this also brings us the importance that people refer to in terms of knowledge mobilization. How do we get the knowledge out there? We create it, but how do we get it to the people who need it and deserve and can use it? And how do we get it to them in the forms and formats that are accessible to them, in a language that they read, or the use of audio video materials. So I think there's lots of exciting things going on. We should mention the book. Christina Clark-Kazak has a book coming out, a co-edited collection, and really talks about how to doing research with refugees. And this has been a question that's been raised in the chat. So it'll be coming out in February. I don't have the name of it, but we'll look forward. I think we'll be promoting it here on the webinar series. And it really is an excellent collection of different kinds of research being done in different methods and throughout the Global South. So really look forward to seeing that book. I think, there we are. There it is, documenting, wonderful. See, the LERRN team are wonderful. You mentioned something and then they produce it. So there it is. So we'll be looking for that, and we will be bringing that to you in the new year. I want to also encourage people, you can ask question and answers. Please pose them if you have a question. We have a couple more minutes to deal with questions, and encourage you to do that. I don't know if anyone else has seen some of the questions that we need to have it responded to. I think some of these are sort of ongoing. Yep.
I wonder if I could just add a couple of observations to some of the questions already raised. Really, this conversation prompts me to think, how can we design research processes that are inclusive, where questions can come from multiple fora, where, the research design can come from multiple places, so that it opens up research, as a practice that a wider number of people can engage in, rather than a select few. I also think of, I've read a number of master's dissertations and PhDs or, journal articles coming from Southeast Asia. And I'm very passionate about sort of building research capacity in Asia, and it frustrates me that some of what I read that's published don't seem to engage with questions or reflections that have been in, that the international community of scholars has been in conversation about, about power and trust and relationships. And so somehow I sense that scholarship is being done in a lot of places, but the scholarship is not connected to dialogues and debates that, have been around for the last 20, 30, 40 years, So for me, it's also about how can we provide greater, stronger foundations for research by reflecting on what has been done before. Some of these conversations are not new conversations, but yet they're presented like new conversations, So I find that a bit frustrating, because I think if only you had read so-and-so who raised this, in the 1990s, and so raised this in 2014, like, somehow I get the sense that our scholarship would be so much more powerful and informed if there was a stronger foundation of the debates and the issues. And it doesn't have to be restricted to a small number of scholars. Why are we not bringing these conversations to refugees who want to be researchers, practitioners who want to be researchers, and to widen the space so that it's not just a select few people who are engaged with these debates that we struggle with as scholars. So how do we open it up? That's important,
May I add to Alet's point? Because of our research on refugee-led organizations, we are very much realizing something, is that how can we empower refugees in a way who are traumatized on one hand, traumatized from the war that they encountered, one, traumatized from the fear that they are living in host countries. One of our partners, and James, you may agree with me on that, Sawiyan is a body that has been very much creating a space. Here we're talking about a powerful space for refugees who are Somali, Sudanese, and Yemeni in a country that does not at all believe in their rights. Very interesting is that every time we try to engage with them, there is this shying away that you researchers, we are fearing you because you are, and here we come to the word advocacy. I want to advocate your voice, but they are fearing the voice that I can bring out because that might risk their status. So here we're talking about two words, advocacy and the risk sometimes that could generate for the person. And the second point is the way that we can empower through research, through funding, through collaboration between the North and the South. We're creating this empowerment for a person who has been traumatized, and I can say traumatized as at multi-levels, not post-war and pre-war, post-displacement and pre-displacement because of the conditions that they have been living under. So how we, and as scholars on one hand, as partners between the global North and the global South, and as donors, we're opening up the call for donors, we're able to create a space for these people who have been traumatized. And I want to make use of what Mark talked when he was talking about COVID, is that suddenly during COVID, we realized the power of the virtual space. Could it be a possibility that we are giving more space, wider space for these refugees to come out and speak up, try their luck through the virtual space, because this is in a way protecting them away from the authorities? One point just to think of, how can we make also of the current virtual spaces that have been opened up for us in the recent year? Thank you.
Very good points.
Yes.
I mean,
Okay.
Mark?
Urub, you have brought something very interesting. I think it is like what Foko has talked about, controlling the body. But then through the concept of the virtual space, I think the mind is not controlled.
Yes.
For instance, we are not moving out of Dadaab, and we are doing quite a lot of things as researchers. Otherwise, if it was the body moving, getting documentation and everything to interact with James and you and everybody in a space that would be created, couldn't happen. But we are very much excited that as refugee researchers, our minds are not controlled. It is just a wild mind, if I can say, going everywhere. And that is the beauty of being a researcher, because we have all these connections, the relationship and everything at our hands, even though we don't move physically. So that is what I think should be encouraged, so that at least in the mind there, we feel very free and able to do quite a lot of things with other people and change the situation in an amazing way. Of course, I've not moved, but we can still change the situation. So that's what that is our expectation, and that's the kind of thing that we also vision or imagine that should appear and happen everywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, this speaks to the point that Denise raised in the Q&A box about, and here I'll just read Denise's point. What do you think what do you think about the challenges that stem from representing the differences among refugees, such as differences in political views and writing about those differences? Can we talk about writing the refugees not just as a singular refugee subject? And I think this is exactly the point. I mean, the point that Urub made about the work that she's been doing with Sawiya, the work that Mark and the Dadaab Response Association has been doing, it further speaks to this question of why this localized approach to research, this rethinking about research partnerships, and why rethinking these partnerships at the stage of setting the research agenda is so critical. And you know, mea culpa, when I think of my work in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, you know, you arrive in a country to do research and you sort of default, well, who can help with the research? Well, go to UNHCR, go to the large international NGOs, and they'll facilitate field work. But the fact is, using that as an entry point, you are then constrained by the policy paradigms of, you know, what that political economy of the refugee response wants you to have as the focus of your work. And those variations, that intersectional differences in terms of nationality, political opinion, but also in terms of class and ethnicity, all of these differences can become effaced. But what the work of the Dadaab Response Association has done, what Urub is doing in Jordan right now, is recognizing that taking that inclusive approach to setting the research agenda, yes, with all of the challenges of trust and risk and what have you, but what it does is it provides this opportunity for research to be more honestly engaged with the really heterogeneous experiences that co-occupy these contested spaces. That it's not a singular experience to be studied and reified, but it's a very messy complexity to try to embrace and not to try and reduce in this parsimonious way to try and simplify it to fit into particular frames, but for research to really elaborate on the complexity, which then speaks to the relevance of that research, because it shows that these singular responses that are proposed are not appropriate to the diversity that we actually witness and experience and engage with in these spaces. So Denise, it's an excellent question. I think builds really, really well from what we've heard from Mark, from Urub, and from Alice as well. But in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah.
Yes, we're running out of time. And Rula has made an important point in terms of the challenge of local knowledge production and how to do that, and that we need to pay more attention to those dynamics. I don't know if we got 1 minute left for each of you, Urub and Alice and Mark. Would like to make something? Can we start with you, Urub?
Sorry. Thank you very much. Challenge of knowledge production. There are always challenges. There are always authoritarian states, but there's always an agency. And this agency that exists on one hand amongst the refugees, we really need to augment it as much as we can through the voices that we are bringing out through our scholarship, through their engagement with us, and very much with the idea thinking along with us. But most importantly, which has been very much of a concern in my work, is the issue of their capacity. We really need to understand that these people, lots of the refugees, have lost opportunities in their education. That never means that they cannot work with us. That never means that they cannot be part of our work. That never means that we cannot talk to them through our documentations. We can do it through documentaries, through exhibitions, through drawings, through different tools that we really need to widen our perspective and not to limit it only to the word. This is one of the things that I think we very much need to consider.
Thank
Creative
you.
production.
Alice, do you have just a few
Yeah,
seconds?
just a really Just a really quick response. We didn't really deal adequately with the risks that scholars and researchers and practitioners and refugees face as reprisals for the research that they do. I think that is something that we can think about and work into more strategically in terms of partnerships. So how can well-respected institutions in the North give legitimacy to, or lend legitimacy to refugees and local scholars for the research findings that are produced? And stand with them in solidarity so that refugees and local scholars and practitioners don't have to stand alone facing their authoritarian, governments and be at risk for how they speak up. But how can that solidarity be built? And also sometimes the criticisms can come from elsewhere, from powerful, well-respected institutions, so that local researchers and refugees can remain safe while making sure that the issues are raised in important and significant policy circles, So I think we can turn these relationships into something that provides greater space and agency and protection for refugees and local scholars.
Thank you. It's time for closing, I'm afraid. James, I'll turn it back to you. And there was a question. This has been recorded and will be available at the LERRN website.
It will be recorded. It will be available on the LERRN website. I'd like to just a few words to conclude. First of all, just to say a sincere thanks to Susan for moderating through Zoom updates, through webcams that don't work, through a participant joining us from the back of the hall and coming up onto the stage. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Urub. Thank you to Maha in absentia for so many of the ideas that she has shared that we've been able to reflect. But Susan, such a privilege to share this space with you and to thank you for your commitment to being inclusive and responsive to changing circumstances. Thank you to the entire LERRN team, especially to Rachel McNally, who's been the spearhead, the leader in organizing this series, and to the entire LERRN team and their technical skills in making this happen. Let me just note that where this is the second in a series of webinars, we will be meeting in December to plan the next webinars in this series on ethical research. We anticipate that the next webinar will be in likely late January. We're still working on that details, but will feature Christina Clark-Kazak and Kasia Grabska with their edited collection documenting displacement. And they're asking how innovative we can be in sharing some of these elements. This is really going to be some of the practical how-to questions in the doing of ethical research. We look forward to that. We also know, look ahead, save the date. The 11th of March will be a session with Sadia Hocic and Larissa Kutovic and others looking at questions of positionality and this notion of the refugee researcher and unpacking some of those questions. There will be other sessions around knowledge mobilization and addressing the political economy of refugee research. Stay tuned for that. We look forward to sharing those details. So please follow us on Twitter to get those updates. I'd also encourage all participants to consider the special issue of Forced Migration Review. The details are there in the chat box. The issue of Forced Migration Review on knowledge, voice, and power is due to be published in July 2022. The deadline for full submissions is on the 15th of February. We did have a webinar yesterday on writing for FMR. A recording of that webinar will be posted shortly. We are including in this process a mentorship program so that individuals who are maybe writing for FMR for the first time, especially researchers from the Global South, individuals with the displacement experience who would like additional guidance and support in submitting to this special issue, there are details of that process that are available online. So please consider that call for submissions for Forced Migration Review. But finally, once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much, Urub, for joining us on zero notice. You weren't planning for this when you came to the webinar today. But Alice and Mark, as always, I've learned so much from the two of you. So Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who helped put this together. Thank you everyone who's attending. Stay well and stay safe. Until next time. Thank you.